I wanted to, we're especially excited to have our speakers here this morning talk on the mystery of how to access donor advice funds. Dave Russo has talked at a couple of our previous programs and is always such a wealth of knowledge. And we were happy to hear he partnered with Lisa Barr from the National Philanthropic Trust to share on this topic. So we're really excited to have you here. I wanted to also let you know that TVNPA has a lot of exciting programs in the works. So please be sure and check our emails to stay up to date on some of these, because some of them are going to be time sensitive, and we want to make sure that you don't miss out. You could also reach out to Carol at the email. Right now, the email is, you can email her at carol@tvnpa.org. If you want to make sure if you're a member of TVNPA and you want to make sure you get special emails that we send out to our members only about grants and things along those lines. So at this point, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Carolyn so we can get started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Carolyn Siegfried, the very proud board chair for the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance. And I have the privilege today of sharing an introduction for both of our speakers today. And as Kathy said, we're very grateful to have David returning to us. Many of you, I'm sure that was a draw because you've heard him speak before for TVNPA, and have Lisa join him this time as well. So Lisa Barr joined the National Philanthropic Trust in January 2020 as a regional director serving the Western US. She provides charitable planning expertise to donors and their advisors to accelerate giving and unlock illiquid assets for social good. Lisa brings more than 14 years of philanthropic experience to her role. She previously served as Director of Philanthropic Entrepreneurship at Silicon Valley Community Foundation and has held Executive Director and Development positions in nonprofit art organizations. Lisa earned a Master's in Business Administration from Boston University Quanstrom School of Business and a Bachelor of Music from Vanderbilt University. She is currently pursuing the Chartered Advisor in Philanthropy, or CAP designation. Lisa is a frequent speaker on philanthropic topics for audiences of financial, legal, tax, and nonprofit professionals. She has presented on charitable gift and non-cash asset and nonprofit revenue stream diversification, among other topics, at the Conference of Charitable Giving, convening the Advancement Network, and elsewhere. Lisa has written articles for the National Philanthropic Trust on topics including impact investing and strengthening client advisor connections in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Lisa, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Nice to have you. David is the Senior Director of Planned Giving and Corporate Relations for Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County. He is responsible for building and stewarding relationships with donors and with estate and financial planning professionals to provide information about Catholic Charities programs and services to end poverty and build strong families in Santa Clara County. He coordinates suggestions for planned giving vehicles and gift plans to facilitate constituent desires to put an end to poverty. He also acts as corporate relations manager, facilitating partnerships between socially responsible Bay Area companies and the poverty alleviation work of many in the Santa Clara County. David brings over 14 years of charitable gift planning experience. Prior to Catholic Charities, he was the director of estate and gift planning for the American Cancer Society, serving the Silicon Valley and Central Coast regions, and the Planned Giving Association at Silicon Valley Community Foundation. While there, he established their charitable gift annuity program, facilitated the highly successful real estate gift platform, and administered their $50 million remainder trust portfolio. David currently serves as board chair for Starting Arts, sings tenor in the Silicon Valley Chorale, and is a legacy giving mentor for the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance. Welcome back, David.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
So now I'm going to turn it over to you. The ball's in your court, Lisa and David.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for having us. And I just want to make sure that you're seeing our slides on the screen. Awesome.
We are.
Well, again, I'm really happy to be here. David and I have been friends for a long time and have some shared professional experience. And we both also really love donor advised funds and think of them as a great vehicle that we want to help your organizations take advantage of in your fundraising success. So we today want to talk about DAFs. We'll start by just kind of getting everybody on the same page. We'll just do a little bit of a primer, make sure we're speaking the same language about donor advised funds. Then we'll move into a section to talk a little bit about some of the criticisms of DAFs and the myths surrounding donor advised funds. And then we'll move into a little bit of a section where I will share some detail about the functionality of DAFs. And then in turn, David will share how you and your organizations can take advantage of that specific functionality to further your fundraising work. So we will plan to pause a few times throughout the presentation to take questions in specific areas. But also we would encourage you please to put some questions in the chat. Our wonderful hosts will interrupt us from time to time to raise your questions, and we'll also have some question time at the end. So again, thanks for having us. And I do want to start by mentioning that this presentation was developed by National Philanthropic Trust, or NPT, you'll hear me say, and in response to the publishing of a white paper, which we put together in collaboration with Donor Perfect, the CRM, that some of you might use. So at the end of this presentation, we'll share a link to the CRM, or excuse me, to the white paper. So you'll have the chance to review that as well as some other resources. We'll also make these slides available to you as well. So with that, David, I think I'll turn it over to you for getting us started.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I want to share that DAFs are nothing new. Donor advised funds have grown in popularity. You all see the data that comes out annually, and that chart keeps rising. But I think it helps to really look at some numbers. Donor advised funds represented fully 9% of all donations in the United States. That's 9% of 142. Sorry, that represents $142 billion spent, if you will, into donor advised funds. The rise continues, and I feel like the train will leave without us if we do not understand them and do not know how to engage donors who have them. The average DAF size is $162,000. There are 873,000 DAFs in the United States. That represents, again, $142 billion. It's very significant how much money's there. As we talk through this, we're trying to think of the potential of $142 billion already set aside for charity. That's the takeaway we want you to think about with the sheer volume of DAF dollars and DAF accounts. Lisa?
Thanks, David. And I do want to mention the numbers that you'll see us present today. Many of those are derived from NPT's annual donor advised fund report. So our organization for the past 10 plus years has put together a comprehensive snapshot of the donor advised fund sector. It's not just NPT's data, but it's looking at the 990s of all the major DAF sponsors and pulling together a snapshot of the sector and its growth. So that's a resource we'll link to as well, but I just wanted to share that that's going to be the basis for a lot of the data you'll hear from us today. So just to do that level set that I mentioned at the top, I want to make sure that we all understand what DAFs are and that we're speaking the same language about them. And I hope this will also help as you're working with donors who have DAFs who may know this language, that you can speak in that same language with them. So at a very high level, a donor advised fund is an account that is held at a public charity, which is usually referred to as a DAF sponsor. And we think about the fact that DAFs have been around for a long time. These aren't brand new vehicles. They've certainly been growing in the last 15 years or so. But the first DAFs were started just way back in the 1930s. actually at the New York Community Trust, which is the community foundation in New York City. They were the very first sponsor of donor advised funds. And then we've been seeing this tremendous growth of DAFs over the past 15 to 20 years with just their ease of use. I mentioned the word DAF sponsor. That's what we often refer to the public charities who offer donor advised funds to donors. And just as there is a wide variety of different kinds of donors who have DAFs, there is a DAF sponsor for every kind of DAF donor. So that could be a community foundation, like your brand new community foundation in the Tri-Valley area or the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. It could be a financial institution, your Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab. Those investment firms started public charities. They are separate entities that they use to host donor advised funds. It could be an independent donor advised fund sponsor. So that's like NPT or the American Endowment Foundation. They're nationally focused, but aren't connected to one of those financial institutions. Or they could be a single issue charity. So a Jewish federation or many universities and hospitals are establishing donor advised fund programs internally. So when a donor establishes an account, a donor advised fund account, we think about kind of a 3-phase life cycle for a donor advised fund. It starts with a contribution into the DAF. It continues with those assets being held as property of the DAF sponsor. They grow tax-free over time. And then the most important work, that money goes out the door to support charities like yours in the form of grants. So those contributions can look like a lot of different things. We'll talk a little bit about the breadth of assets that donors use to start their donor advised funds and to add into them. On the investment side of things, most DAF sponsors have kind of a menu of investment options that they provide to their DAF donors. It could be maybe some social impact focused investments. And many DAF sponsors even allow for their donors to recommend an outside investment manager for those funds. And on the grant making side of things, generally those grants are going out to qualified IRS 501c3 public charities in the United States, but some DAF sponsors also provide the ability for donors to give internationally. So just a couple more things here. You heard me talk about gifts and grants. That can be confusing sometimes, but the general vernacular here, we talk about gifts going into the donor advised fund and grants going out of the donor advised fund to your charities. So gifts and grants out, that's something that you'll hear your DAF donors say as well. And then you also heard me use the word recommend. Recommend is a very important word. Control is a very important word when it comes to donor advised funds. A donor gives up control when they make a contribution into that DAF. They have then the privilege to recommend how the funds are invested and to recommend grants to support the charities that they care about. A sponsor of a DAF is in the business of facilitating philanthropy, making donors happy. They're not ever really trying to deny those recommendations unless they're, for some reason, there's a grant purpose that's not charitable or a 501c3 that's fallen out of good standing with the IRS that they want to grant to. But that said, it is the DAF sponsors' dollars, not the donors, by the time that money is within the DAF. So that's our DAF 101 in 3 minutes. I want to take a pause here to see if there's any questions from the audience about just this level set about DAFs.
So Lisa, there is one question in the chat, and that was a great explanation. And that is, what is the difference between endowments versus DAFs? And there's different types of endowments, or maybe DAFs and private foundations.
Yeah, so we'll get into some of that as we go. I would say at a high level, this donor advised fund is an IRS defined account type that's held at a public charity. That's in comparison to a private foundation or a public charity that has an endowment. They have permanently restricted dollars that they are holding within either that private foundation or the public foundation, like if your charity has an endowment. Those dollars are permanently restricted. They are, there is an annual payout rate that a private foundation's endowment must have. 5% a year must go out the door. David, is there more you would say there to define the three?
Yeah, at the most highest level, and Lisa's absolutely right, because when you're talking private foundation, now you're talking a very different set of IRS regulations. But at the highest level, an endowment is a spending policy that's applied to something. It could be applied to a DAF. The spending policy is you're not allowed to touch corpus, and you're only allowed to spend what you grow at a certain rate, or no more than 5%, let's say annually. So you can have a DAF that's an endowment, because now the spending policy that is endowment has been applied to the DAF. That's the super highest explanation I'll add to that. Does that answer your question?
I think it probably, and then one quick question too is, so and this is an important clarification, is, so are you saying that donors don't have a say in how DAFs spend their contributions? So that's that recommendation versus control.
Yeah, exactly right. So it is that recommendation. A DAF sponsor is really in the business of facilitating a donor's philanthropy. And so they are going to do their best to take that donor's recommendation and make that grant to the charity that the donor wishes to support. And it's really only when there is an impermissible purpose or maybe some type of benefit that's going back to the donor in exchange for the grant. And we'll talk about some of those intricacies as we go. Or maybe, with some single issue charities or geographically focused DAF sponsors, there may be some, not legal reasons to not make a grant, but just sort of internal policy reasons at the DAF sponsor, where, if you say that maybe the Tri-Valley Community Foundation will say, you can only support organizations in the Tri-Valley with grants from your DAF. And I don't know if that's the case, but just by way of example. So that's really where that word recommend comes in, but we're really here to facilitate a donor's wishes the best we can.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on that, we're DAF sponsoring agencies, financial advisors, and especially estate planning attorneys and nonprofit attorneys are going to be very, very careful around that language. You are rewarded a deduction when you give up control. And so the IRS gets very anxious about the term control. So we are careful to use the word recommend, because the DAF advisor, that's usually the person or family that opened the DAF, can recommend to the sponsoring agency. And then, as Lisa pointed out, almost all the time, the sponsoring agency, whose goal it is to facilitate philanthropy, accepts that recommendation and makes that gift. Under very rare circumstances, or the ones related to mission, they may not, right? But it's really a tax and IRS-driven differentiation. Control is not control. Recommendations are almost always heeded, but we're just careful to use that because of that deduction, give up control relationship.
All right, and Lisa and David, there was one other question which you may or be covering later, and that is, Lisa, you mentioned that nonprofit organizations are now sponsoring DAFs. So the question is, can all public charities sponsor a DAF? So
I'm trying to think of how much I want to editorialize on this.
Yeah.
All could, yes. Any public charity could become a DAF sponsor. Should every public charity become a DAF sponsor?
No.
Probably not. I would say, it's generally, very large charities. Stanford University has a donor advised fund program. Very large hospital systems may have one. And usually in that case, the DAF sponsor would have some of those recommendation guardrails where maybe 50% of your money has to go to that charity that sponsors the DAF to Stanford. And I don't know that that number is exactly right, but then 50% of it can go out to other charities. But I think that, from where I'm sitting, all of your organizations are doing very important work. Probably managing a donor advised fund would be a little bit outside of your core mission. And so when there are all of these other sponsors, many different kinds of sponsors who have this expertise and are able to do it in a cost-effective way, I would recommend that you would think long and hard before considering hosting a donor advised fund to your organization's activities.
Okay, I think that covers all the current questions. So I will let you guys move on with your slides.
Perfect. Well, David, you and I have both worked with DAF donors in lots of different ways. Tell us, what have you heard from these donors about the way they work with their DAF?
Thanks, Lisa. Again, when Carolyn introduced us, we hope we're adding value in the fact that both Lisa and I have worked on both sides of the table. We've worked for sponsoring agencies, and we've worked for nonprofits. And both of us have been development professionals. I currently am, and Lisa still is, but that was the main focus for the early part of her career. So we're hoping that when we share some testimonial, that that we're adding a little gravitas, because we speak from experience. So Lisa talked about the DAF life cycle, which is essentially contribute, grow, and then grant, essentially, or benefit charity. And what's really great is that both Lisa and I have received incredible testimony from donors when we work with them, when they use their DAF, both to create it, to grow it, and then to support our agencies or agencies in the community. And one of the things that donors say all the time is that it's just incredibly easy. And that's a triple underline. The DAF as a tool for families is just incredibly simple. They're very easy to establish, very easy to make gifts into, and people just really love it. And what also happens, we hear often, is that instead of at the end of the year gathering a pile of receipts from various charities they've contributed to for their tax professional like CPA, they're just handing over one. Usually that's sent in a nice year-end statement from the sponsoring agency. One simple tax receipt for all of the taxable events, the charitable donations, because there's only one account. So that goes into the account and they earn their deduction. And then from the DAF, they can contribute to underlying charities as much as they want, and they don't have to track all those receipts. So, because from DAF to charity, the deduction's not rewarded. You get it at the front end when you make the gift into the DAF. So they just love the simplicity of it, especially at year-end tax time. Next, what happens is, generally what happens is the sponsoring agency will work with the donor to establish an investment, how the DAF dollars are invested. Just like, let's say, a retirement account, they could be invested incredibly conservative, or frankly not at all, in a cash vehicle, or they can be highly invested in an 80-20 publicly exchanged stock mix. And then what happens is the sponsoring agency provides annual statements or quarterly statements, so they can see the performance, grants in, grants out, dollars in, investment performance, and that makes it feel like it's their money. Now, we're careful about that because it's not their money. As we described earlier, they were rewarded a deduction, but it's really encouraging for families because they feel like they still have some level of control, which they do through recommendation. And donors really like that. I got my reward and I can still be involved. So they really love that. And sometimes DAF dollars grow, especially in a good market. So that feels good. Their ability to help community grows through investment. That feels great for donors. And then lastly, when the dollars come out to charities, people just love it. They're not writing multiple checks. They're not saving up the money for 1 week in December when they're making all their gifts. They do it as part of a larger plan. They do it as part of a simple way to make gifts. And what also we love is that the DAFs very frequently make giving super easy. If you as a family are giving to 5 or 10 charities regularly, your church, your university, oftentimes the sponsoring agency have portals, online portals, just like paying bills online. You go online, all of your charities you give to normally are auto-populated, and you can give a grant very, very quickly. In fact, even reactionary. The fundraiser calls you and say, hey, we have this opportunity to do this scholarship, or we have this opportunity to do this, and we're asking you for $1,000. You can go right online and make that happen within 5 minutes. It's really, really great. So it's all about easy is the frequent and common testimonial we're getting from donors. Lisa?
So who are these donors? Who are these people who have DAFs? And really, these are your donors. More and more individuals and families are establishing donor advised funds every year. And it's very likely that your organizations are seeing DAF grants come to you more and more often. So we really want to be focusing today's talk on how you can really make your organizations appeal to those donors who have DAFs, and how you can continue that ease that David was just talking about, how you can specifically make it easy for them to give to your organizations. So who are these DAF donors? We mentioned that average account size of $162,000. That number is coming down every single year. It's, as DAFs are becoming kind of more democratized and available to more people, but that's still a pretty good chunk of change. You're talking about people who have some wealth, who have some interest in philanthropy and see the benefit of setting aside this money for their future charitable giving. That range of wealth levels can be pretty significant. As in the past, most DAF sponsors would have a minimum account size of something in the range of maybe $5,000. Some of the biggest DAF providers have actually just completely removed that minimum to get started, and you could go establish a DAF for just $100. And so that's making it possible for many different people to take advantage of this very unique tool. On the way other side of that wealth spectrum, as people are finding the ease of this tool, they're realizing that for the very wealthiest individuals who may have always considered establishing a private foundation for their philanthropy, they're realizing, hey, I can do just about everything I'd like to do for my philanthropy in a DAF. Why bother establishing a private foundation and having to take care of all of the administrative work that comes with having a private foundation? And that's resulting in us seeing DAFs in the tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars. So quite a broad spectrum. These are also very active philanthropists. We'll talk a bit more about DAF payout as we go, but on average, you're seeing 20% of the balance of a DAF leave each and every year across all DAFs. So very active people. These are the donors who you're cultivating, who you're receiving funds from year in and year out. And I also want to mention, David and I have experience working with a handful of DAF sponsors. These DAF sponsors are agnostic. They're in the business for the most part of getting money out the door to make their donors happy and doing their philanthropic work. So we want to be focusing today on not trying to get to the DAF sponsors and, oh, if Lisa just knew me and my charity, she would have all her donors give to us. Really, we want to be clear that a DAF sponsor isn't making the funding decisions. They are there to help that funding process occur. So we want to be talking about how you can be better cultivating these DAF donors and making it easy for them to give to you through your DAFs, rather than saying you need to be knocking on the door of your local community foundation or of Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard, and then that's the way in. That's not going to be a good use of your time, but I think the tips and tricks we'll share today, we hope will be a really good use of your time. David, over to you.
Great. This is the fun part, everyone. What I'm going to do, I'm going to say the assumption, and these assumptions come right from me and my colleagues from the nonprofit side. I'm willing to bet we're going to answer 5 or 10 of your questions already. This is what I think about DAFs, and this is what the data is saying. That's what we're going to do now. This will likely inspire questions. Let's get through it. And then we'll answer the questions as we go. And we're definitely going to pause after this because this is kind of the fun part. Okay, Lisa, I am going to say the assumption and then let's you share with us what the data is showing. Fair?
Sounds good.
Great. So my first concern is that DAFs are nothing but lockboxes. That money goes in and no money goes out, and it's a great way to hide money and that nonprofits never see it in the end. Frankly, I think that donor advised funds keep money from nonprofits. What does the data show, Lisa?
Yeah, so the data shows that that's really not the case, that these aren't, safes of money, as David has said, that get thrown in the ocean and no one thinks about them again. Donors who have DAFs are active philanthropists, and on average, 20% of DAF balances are leaving the DAFs into the hands of charities each and every year. So, with a private foundation, there is a minimum required annual payout of 5%. A DAF does not have a required minimum payout, but at the end of the day, that 5% becomes kind of the floor the ceiling rather than the floor. Whereas with a DAF, even without having to make grants each year, donors are doing it. They're doing it to the tune of 20% out each year. And there are a lot of different ways you can calculate payout. When we share the DAF report from NPT, we'll also post to you a blog that helps explain what that payout really means and what it could look like when you slice it and dice it different ways. But when you do slice it and dice it different ways, you will see that the money going out of DAFs is far, far exceeding what is coming out of private foundations.
Great. Okay, my next concern is about fees. As someone that used to work at a community foundation, I used to make the argument, and I continue to believe this, that there are fees applied to the DAF, of course, and those fees are used by the supporting agency to pay its staff and do its good work. And I think one could make the argument that at a community foundation, that their fee is also a gift to benefit community, because we all know the benefit of a community foundation, especially this new Tri-Valley Community Foundation. It's going to be a great resource for the community. So the fee makes sense there to me. But what I get a little anxious by is agencies like Fidelity, the charging a fee. To me, it seems like just another way for banks to make money. Thoughts?
Yeah, so every DAF sponsor is a public charity, even the ones that are connected to a financial institution. The people who work for the DAF are employees of a public charity. I'm an employee of a public charity. And when you think about the fees that a donor would pay for the assets under management in their DAF, that's really a fee for service, just like any other investment you might have. In this case, it's often referred to as a charitable administrative fee or a support fee. That's a fee that the DAF is paying to the DAF sponsor to process those checks, those gifts as they come in, or process even more complicated assets than that. And we'll talk about that a bit. That's what I kind of do every day in my day-to-day work. And they're also, these DAF sponsors are performing due diligence on charities. They're cutting the checks out to the charities or maybe making ACH payments. So these are fees that are being paid for a service that's being provided to the donor. And also I would say, because there is such a broad range of DAF sponsors, it's a relatively competitive marketplace, and that is forcing down the fees that a DAF can charge. So you're seeing more and more innovation and use of technology to try to keep those fees as low as possible, so there is as much money as possible to go out the door to charity. I'll also mention there was a question at the beginning about endowments. Charitable endowments pay fees. There's management fees associated there. The administrative costs of a private foundation are sort of taking away from the money that can go out the door to charity as well. So just like your organizations have overhead and have very important expenses to pay staff and retain staff and train staff and do the work of your programs, so a DAF also has fees to support its work.
Thanks. Okay, so I make a DAF, I live my life and I give all my gifts and it's great. I might even benefit the DAF with my estate, but I don't have heirs. What happens to the DAF when I leave? Does the supporting agency just consume it and then go take a vacation to Europe or something?
No. The vast majority of DAFs, when they're established, a donor would have put into place some kind of succession plan. So it could be naming an adult child to take over the advisory role of the DAF. It could be naming a list of charities where the funds will just be distributed to those charities at the end of the day. And if there is no succession plan in place, every DAF sponsor has some policy in place to do something charitable with that money. So that's not just going to keep the lights on at NPT, that's going into a board designated fund where our board would decide, here are some causes happening nationally, wildfires, COVID relief, they are using those funds for good. And in a community foundation as well, you would see generally the kind of fail-safe would be for those funds to flow into their discretionary, what the program officers would use to make discretionary grants to support the work of the community foundation in the community. So in no way is that money going back to the donor or going back to the pockets of the CEO of the DAF sponsor. That money is going out the door to do good in the world.
Great. Okay, last question. Overwhelmingly, I get gifts from DAFs where I have no idea who the donor is. That I get a check from NPT and it just is from NPT. I have no idea what the donor's name is. I have no idea who to thank or cultivate. And that feels like most gifts that come from DAFs feel that way to my agency. Can you address that?
Yeah, so when NPT puts together its DAF report, we look at that data very closely, and we've come to find that actually less than 1% of DAF grants go out the door anonymously. And there can be good reason for that anonymity. It could be that the donor has just had some type of major wealth event and they want to do something philanthropic, but aren't yet ready to kind of field cultivation and solicitation calls from charities. We often see donors who are faithful might have faith-based reasons for wanting to give anonymously. So there can be, a host of reasons behind a donor wanting to give anonymously, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of grants are going out with some identifying information about the donor.
Great. Okay, so I just looked at the chat. There's not too many questions. So let's just summarize with demystifying DAFs, and I'll add a few other things. First off, and this is very, very important. We as nonprofit professionals who work on the nonprofit side for the service charities directly need to see a donor advised fund as yet another tool in our quiver. And I will explain more about how I've deployed that in actual real stories about how I've used a donor advised fund, even though I don't work for a sponsoring agency. But there's some interesting statistics around what's happened with DAFs specific to what's going on with the economy and the pandemic. So NPT shared a 2019 study from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Memphis that showed that DAF are actually somewhat recession-proof. So that university data comes from the 2008 market crash. And what they saw is certainly gifts into DAFs dropped because people had less money, but grants out of DAFs only dropped about 7%. The point is, the way we're reading that is when the community needs philanthropy, DAF dollars are waiting there and donors understand that, and they activate their DAF in community. And that assumption is also was assumed and is correct given the data from the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw is that dollars into DAFs certainly dropped, just as they did in 2008. But dollars out of DAFs to the community went up 29.8%. And moreover, the sheer number of grants went up 37%. So that's why we say DAFs are somewhat recession-proof. They're money set aside already for philanthropy. They're recommended by those who are already philanthropic and care about community, and they understand the needs of the community in times of need, if you will. So that's very, very powerful data, and we just think that's really, really important. So the next question becomes for us nonprofits: how do we engage and cultivate them as donors? That's our next kind of challenge, if you will. I'm going to pause for questions. No? Okay.
All right. Yep. No, we're not seeing none right now, except for we'll go back later at the end about international.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Okay, Lisa.
Yeah, so this is the section where I'm going to share even more detail about how DAFs function, about how donors are using DAFs. And then David will share some tips and tricks from his own experiences and otherwise of how you and your charities can leverage that functionality of the DAF in the way that you engage with these donors. So kind of first and foremost, donors are using DAFs to recommend grants to charity. That's kind of the only reason you would establish a DAF would be if you were interested in becoming an active grant maker and getting money out the door to charities that you care about. David talked about how DAFs can be recession-proof, how they can provide that really reliable source of funding for your agencies. But in addition to that, they can be kind of a little bit of a pool of risk capital, where if you as a charity have maybe a brand new program or some sort of new innovative intervention that you are deploying within your community, DAF donors are great people to go to solicit for those sorts of opportunities because they have this ready pool of capital that is going to do nothing but go be deployed for charities. So DAF donors really are there to get those grants out the door. I also, we've talked a little bit about this misconception around DAFs as a little bit of a warehouse of charitable dollars. Really, money in a DAF is going nowhere but out to charity. And so it's really just money that hasn't gone to charity quite yet. And there can be some good reasons for that, where perhaps a donor has a huge liquidity event in a single year. They want to fund a DAF and think about their philanthropy in the future. Well, they can go ahead and establish a DAF, have that money grow tax-free, and then there's even more to give to charity down the line. That can look like a naming opportunity or some sort of major significant gift to one of your agencies. So that's just some of the various ways that donors are thinking about using their DAFs to get money out the door to the charities they care about.
Okay, nonprofit professionals, get your pen and paper out, because now this is the practical tips how to get this going for you guys. Okay, if there's one, so first off, I'm going to couch this as both internal work and external work. Okay, so there's the internal work you and your agency needs to do almost from an administrative perspective, and then there's the external work. Now, the first one sounds like external, but in my experience, I've come to learn that it's actually internal. So if there's any one thing you can take away from at least my portion of this presentation is this: the best way to cultivate DAF donors is do great work and share your story with the community. Do great work and then capture the stories of impact and communicate it often. Use your social media channels, use your mailers, use your speaker series, use your tours, use your donor outreach, tell your story. What I have learned is that is really an internal process, is that capturing and telling the stories happens alongside of the work. Okay, that's your big takeaway. Number two, there's some things you need to do internally. Number one is, if you're using a CRM system or some sort of finance system to capture your incoming gifts of any sort, any donor advised fund gift, you need to be absolutely certain to soft credit your donor. As Lisa has already said, only 1% of donors from DAFs are anonymous. So 99% of your donors are telling you who they are. It's in the letter attached to the gift. Make sure that your finance or your gift processing team are linking that so that you can see this donor is giving. They're just giving it through NPT or Fidelity or Community Foundation. Very, very important. Get your soft credits right. Next is this. No matter how small the gift from a DAF, even if it's $100, put your DAF donor into your major gifts stewardship track. So if you have a major gift stewardship track where someone's giving $5,000 or $10,000, and that puts that donor into like a different stewardship system, they're being invited to events, they're getting handwritten cards, they're being assigned a development professional. Even if the DAF gift is $100, we know that the average DAF size is $162,000. So the potential on average is quite great. So treat every DAF donor as a major gift donor. That's super important. And that is an operational internal decision you make. Your CRM system flags it, someone makes a decision, and they move over to that portfolio. Next is, if you ever get contacted by, let's say, NPT, and someone's asking you highly technical questions like what's your tax ID number or address, give it to them. You don't have to hide that information. Make getting money from DAFs easier. So if let's say you've never received a DAF and NPT calls you because you're new in their system, they're going to need some information from you. Remember, your EIN number is a public number. It's not secret, right? It's not your social security number. Share it with everybody. I tattoo mine on my forehead if I can, because it's not secret information. So if you get that phone call, be eager to answer the questions, right? Next is when you're kicking out your gift letters, your gift acceptance, or your thank you letters. Our CRM system at Catholic Charities actually has a special letter that kicks out for DAFs that removes the tax deduction language. At the bottom of our gift acceptance letters, it says, no goods or services were received. That's how you substantiate your deduction. Our CRM system on a DAF gift removes that. Now it's just an acknowledgement, but it keeps you and your donor safe from double dipping. That's an important thing. One last thing on this subject is, we never want to give tax advice, and we always defer to our great partners at our sponsoring agencies to know the ins and outs. And I've called Lisa on a few times, hey, what about this? And Lisa knows because she works there. So we don't want to offer that advice, but we also should know some ins and outs. And here are some ins and outs. Do not forget. A DAF cannot pay for a split interest gift, like a remainder trust. The DAF cannot pay your seat at a gala because why? You're getting a benefit. The DAF can't, or a qualified distribution from your retirement account can't go into a DAF. It has to go to a public charity. So if you're working with their donor who has a DAF and they say, oh, I think I'm going to use my retirement account this year to support the charities I care about, you just want to flag them and say, listen, you should talk to your DAF sponsor, because I'm almost certain that you cannot use that to support your DAF. It has to come to public charities. And all we just want to do is raise the flag on that. Lisa, did I miss any sort of ins and outs there? Oh, I guess the last one was the IRS has blessed supporting pledges with DAFs. Before, you could not support a legally binding pledge with a DAF. The IRS has signed off, but there's a little trick there. Lisa, what's the trick we have to be careful of?
Yeah, so as a DAF sponsor, if a donor has a pledge in place with one of your organizations, the DAF sponsor can send a grant to your organization, but we can't reference the pledge. So that grant letter from NPT is not going to say, and this is fulfilling David Russo's pledge to your agency for $1 million. It's just going to say, here's $1 million recommended by David, and that's it. So it's up to you then to be in touch with David to say, hey, we just got $1 million from your DAF. I think we'll apply that to your pledge. How does that sound? And David will say, that sounds great. That's what I intended. I should have called you.
That's really good.
So that's really how that will be working in practice. Once upon a time, that wasn't possible. A DAF could not be used to help to pay off a donor's pledge. That changed in 2017. So it's just something for you all to be aware of.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Where are we, Lisa?
Yeah,
oh, yes, bunching.
Let's get to bunching, my favorite inelegant term for how donors are often using DAFs and why. And so this is a little bit more on the technical side of things. Bear with this example. We can take questions as well, but at a really high level, I want to explain that another interesting thing that happened in 2017 was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that effectively increased the threshold for where a donor, an individual, would take the standard deduction versus itemizing. It resulted in the number of itemizers effectively being cut in half. So that's very substantial for charities who are interested in working with donors who might find a benefit to being able to take a charitable deduction for their gifts to charity. They can only take that charitable deduction if they're itemizing, and now that pool of people has become quite small. So one way that DAFs can help donors who now fall out of the itemizers kind of territory is through bunching multiple years worth of their philanthropic contributions that they would usually be making over many years. They can instead make a large number of contributions or a sizable contribution in year one, go ahead and itemize in that year, and then use the money in the DAF that they've set aside for all of their future philanthropy. And in those future years, go ahead and take the standard deduction. So the little example we have here with the chart that you see could be, hey, let's imagine we have a couple, they are used to giving about $6,000 annually to charity. Well, now they suddenly fall into this world where they're not going to itemize their deductions. So they're not going to be able to take the charitable deduction for that annual $6,000 that they're giving to charity. Well, what they could do instead is give, say, $18,000 to their DAF in 1 year. They can then get themselves above that threshold to go ahead and itemize. And then in the subsequent years, they can grant out $6,000 from their DAF rather than giving it from their pocket. And then they would go ahead and take the standard deduction in those subsequent years. So that's one reason we've been seeing really big growth of DAFs over the past couple of years. Folks are really understanding that this is a way to still be able to have that tax benefit when they might not quite reach that threshold of some of the, bigger donors who are supporting your charities. So David, what does that mean for charities?
Yeah, well, first off, I'll just share a real world example. Because like all of us fundraising professionals are attempting to do, we're trying to build strong relationships with our donors. Where there's a good, clear, open line of communication where we're working together. So when the Tax Relief Act, the Jobs Act passed, I had a number of donors call, and I'll use Christy and George as an example, and those are their real names. Christy and George gave annually, and they just called us and said, "Listen, we've decided and have been advised to give every other year because of this bunching thing," and they did that for the first year. And then all of a sudden, is a very large gift came the following year, and I was surprised by that. And what they did is they worked with a local community foundation, a different one, happened to be Catholic Community Foundation. And Catholic Community Foundation was doing a promotion where they would double your grant out. So they used the DAF there to fulfill the bunching and get their donation doubled. So the point is, it just goes to show these donors are philanthropic, they're engaged, they know how to plan, they're working with sponsoring agencies and the nonprofits. So it's just really, really powerful. And it comes from the nonprofit side. It comes down to having and working on a great relationship. That's a mutual understanding where there's good lines of communication. So that's important. Next, I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned the internal work of what the nonprofit can do. Here's a little bit of external work the nonprofit can do. Number one, as I said it, your tax ID number is not hidden information. Put it on everything. Put it at the bottom of every single web page of your website, print it on your letters, put it on your pamphlets, anything that goes out, just put it right at the bottom, name of agency, tax ID number. It's not secret. And what that signals is it just makes everybody easier. The DAF sponsor finds it easier, the donor finds it easier. They're going to need that to establish or make a grant, to establish the DAF or make grants to your agency. So make that the tax ID numbers easy to find. Number two is broadcast to the community that you are comfortable with DAF gifts and you frequently receive them. And the way you do that is this, in my opinion, is that in your donations website, you can list ways to give: cash, check, ACS, transfer, stocks, planned gifts such as a bequest, give through your IRA, and then give through your DAF. List it as a giving opportunity. Next is you can look around for those cool DAF widgets. There are these things called widgets that can go onto your website, which allows you to access MPT or the local community foundation rather quickly. So, I can't speak for those widgets, but they do exist, and some of them are fee-based and some of them are not, and some of them are more powerful than others, but it's broadcasting to the community that you're comfortable with DAFs and you encourage them. That's an external effort. Let's see, what else? I mentioned the technical part is that if the donor calls and says, hey, I see that we're having our annual gala and I'm going to buy a table and my whole family's coming and I'm going to pay the $12,000 it costs for that table through my DAF. Well, that doesn't work. And instead, because you've got such great lines of communication with your donor, you would say, Mr. and Mrs. Donor, you can't do that, but here's what I recommend. Please write a personal check from your own money to pay for your gala so you can come and enjoy the event with us and we can celebrate our success with you. And then during the event, we're going to have a paddle raise that funds our X program. And that X program or that paddle raise is absolutely all direct service work. You can, when that paddle raise happens, go ahead and make your gift, and on your remit envelope said, I will make that portion of my gift from my DAF. That is fine. And that's an external effort you can do in a way to work around that sort of gala problem that DAFs frequently have. Did I miss anything, Lisa, on the external part?
No, I think I would just emphasize, I would even say that from the stage, that's another way that you can demonstrate to your donors that you were aware of DAFs. I know many of your donors have DAFs. You can say, hey, this is the time where you can be supporting us, raise your paddle, and then later on you can recommend a grant from your DAF to support XYZ program. I think, more and more donors are understanding how they can be using their DAFs. They might not think of that one. So I would definitely emphasize that as one of these days we get back into ballrooms and have rubber chicken and cute kids singing. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it.
That's funny.
So let me jump now to a little bit around charitable legacy planning. And this is something that DAFs are great for. And this is one of the reasons that donors come to establish DAFs. I talked at the beginning a little bit about what happens if there's not a succession plan in place. I just want to kind of explain just in more detail what that succession plan could look like. Generally, you would see a DAF sponsor saying to a DAF donor as they're establishing the account, hey, what would you like to happen upon your unfortunate passing with the dollars that are in the donor advised fund? They would often name maybe adult children or other family members to become what's called the successor advisor. They could also leave a list of charities that the donor advised fund should support upon the passing of the donor. There are even some DAF sponsors that might allow you to create an endowment with the money that's left over in your DAF so that charities the donor wants to support in perpetuity can receive that support through the DAF. So there's just many ways that DAF sponsors make it possible for donors to be thinking very long-term about what those dollars are going to do. And just a little more on the legacy planning side of things. David alluded to this previously, but as donors are becoming more and more savvy and understanding all of the things they can accomplish through their DAF, we more and more see donors running their entire estates, sometimes very significant estates, through a donor advised fund, where they may, in their will or trust, say, when I pass, I would like all of these assets to flow to the DAF. And with the DAF sponsor, they will have a legacy plan in place that will help the DAF sponsor know what to do with all of those funds. So we're seeing that more and more, and it really relieves some of the administrative burden that an executor would have to undertake if an individual said, hey, executor, I want you to support these 30 charities when I pass. That's a lot of work. A DAF sponsor does that all day long. And so we're always very happy to work with donors to put those types of plans in place. I'll sort of just gloss over some of these next points. David did talk a little bit about some of the other ways that different types of assets do or do not work well with DAFs versus just giving to your charities directly. A DAF could become could be the beneficiary of a life insurance policy. A DAF could be the beneficiary of a retirement account. So as you're working with donors who have DAFs, we'd encourage you to think about if you hear from a donor that they have some of those vehicles, that you can speak to how your charity might play into their estate planning as they're thinking about the legacy planning for the DAF as well. The last thing I'll say here too is many charities who have set up, or excuse me, many families who have set up private foundations are beginning to find that maybe the second generation is not that interested in managing the work of the private foundation. So we'll see private foundations being converted into donor advised funds or wound down into donor advised funds. So that's a way that donors can have the second generation involved in the family's philanthropy, maybe even extend it beyond the kind of programmatic work that the private foundation might have been doing. And we're just seeing that as especially baby boomers are aging and aging out of wanting to be managing their foundations, that they're finding converting those to DAFs can be a great way for the second generation to continue that philanthropic legacy, but to do so in a little bit of a more streamlined way. So let me hand it back to David for the plan giving and estate planning side of things from the charity's perspective.
Yeah, I think, again, this is just an internal procedure. Just as you moved DAF donors into your major gifts track, you'd also, this is what I do at my agency, I also put them in my plan giving cultivation track. Why? Is because we already know they're philanthropic. We already know they're working with advisors. We already know that they've sequestered dollars for charity. It's very, very low hanging fruit. So in my CRM system, all DAF donors get plan giving stewardship and cultivation materials. I also make an annual plan to reach out to them through a phone banking, and not phone banking, but making the calls and say, hey, would you like to have a conversation? And Lisa's going to talk a little bit about this when it comes to complex assets and how we partner with them. But for example, if you're a smaller charity, you can be thinking about how to endow your agency into perpetuity using a sponsoring agency and a DAF. So those are plan giving conversations with you're having with your donor. Like, imagine, yes, we are this small now, but in the future we're growing to this because we have these great plans. We want you to be a part of that, and here's a safe way you can do it. Those are plan giving conversations. And then also, if you have strong relationships and you have the chutzpah, it's absolutely fine to say, donor, would you make us the entire beneficiary of your DAF upon your passing, just like a life insurance policy or an IRA? That it works just fine. And at the end of their life, and per the instructions they left with the sponsoring agency, someone like NPT would then make one final grant of the DAF's balance to your agency. That is not a conversation you're having with NPT. That's a conversation you're having with your donor. That's a plan giving conversation. Lisa?
Yeah, so a little more on the family side of things. Another way we see families using DAFs is to kind of instill those values, not just on the planning side of things for the future, but while everyone's still alive. And so that often looks like a donor naming maybe their adult children or teenage children to be secondary advisors, or these are called different things at different sponsoring agencies, but it's basically a level of advisory privilege on the DAF where maybe you can't change the investments or change the name of the DAF, but you can recommend grants and you can have some access to the work of the DAF. So we are often seeing that happen. We also see that many DAF sponsors are providing philanthropic consulting support for families, helping them think through what are the values we have as a family, what sort of charitable legacy do we want to leave in our community. More and more sponsors are providing those kinds of resources, really aiming towards making a DAF a family affair when it comes to a family's philanthropic legacy.
Lisa, there's some questions in the chat about running your entire estate through the DAF, and I think I'll take a second and address that. And Lisa, if you want to contribute, just chime in. Number one is, of course, you can't run your non-charitable heirs through the DAF. That's not going to work, so you can't dump your entire estate into the DAF and then the DAF benefits your children. That doesn't work. But when it comes to the charitable portion of your estate, running it through the DAF makes a lot of sense in certain circumstances. And to answer that question, I will share a real world example. When I worked at the Community Foundation, I got a call from an advisor saying the donor had 58 underlying charitable beneficiaries. And the woman was incredibly fickle, and she had an Excel spreadsheet that she would change monthly. And it was just becoming a terrible headache. She had to visit her estate planning attorney, be charged $360 an hour to update the estate plan, and have multiple versions of the estate plan. It just didn't work. So the simple and elegant solution, which is, I think, the best way to use a DAF as part of an estate, is you name one charitable beneficiary within the estate plan, NPT, and that underlying beneficiary is the David Russo DAF, correct? So all of the charitable portion of the estate, upon realization of that portion of the estate, goes into the DAF. Then what happens is a letter, what we call a letter of recommendation or a letter of intent, whatever you want to call it, is on file that controls then the DAF money out. So, for example, this donor gave us a list of 58 charities, and the estate plan only held one charity, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And then yearly, this donor would call me and say, I want to make changes to the list. I work for a nonprofit, so I'm not charging her any fees, and she could just update that simply. That's really the best example. So just to reiterate, if you use a DAF to manage the charitable portion of the charitable portion is complex in an estate, keeping one charity, the DAF sponsor, in the estate makes it clean and evergreen. Updating the underlying charities through the sponsoring agency is dynamic and easy. Okay?
Sure.
Let's go to the next. Oh, family. We're doing families. Yes. How do we engage next generation? And this is also a plan giving conversation, of course, because every time you're talking about plan giving, you're talking about competing with heirs, essentially. That's a terrible thing to say, but it is sometimes the way donors perceive that. So what we do, of course, at Catholic Charities is we try to help the children fall in love with us. And we do that by helping to involve the family and second generation in the parents' support of us. So we have family-friendly events. We ask the families to include their children on the decision-making. Catholic Charities has 32 underlying programs that serve infants to seniors. So we ask the donors, hey, do your children have any opinion? You've been supporting seniors, but let's carve out $1,000 of your DAF gift and support children or support the youth. And that came out of a cultivation of the children. So getting them involved, and us as nonprofits can encourage that through those conversations. You can also have advisory boards that are younger. What we did at Catholic Charities that's been very, very effective is we put a call out to donors saying, we would really want to do better on our social media. And let's be honest, social media is the millennials' world and not my world. So we have formed now a committee of younger folks that's helping craft our stories for Instagram and other social media that is more targeted younger. And it's been really, really well received. So we're cultivating new generations really, really well. And then you want to report to them too. If children and family are making gifts, just like any donor, you want to steward them well and show impact. Okay.
Great. So now this, I think, is our last sort of piece of functionality for donor advised funds. And this is my day-to-day world. This is where I live. I'm here in the Bay Area. I work with a lot of entrepreneurial donors who use their donor advised funds to deploy assets beyond just cash and publicly traded securities for philanthropic good. And that can look like privately held stock or hedge fund or private equity interests or cryptocurrency. I am part of a team of 8 regional directors. We all have expertise in this area. We work with entrepreneurial donors around the country to help to accept gifts with this level of complexity. And we do that so that your organizations don't have to. There's no reason that every charity should have the ability to liquidate these kinds of more complex assets when all of or many DAF sponsors play that role. And I just want to share one kind of simple example of a donor that I'm working with recently. And this is a kind of typical case where I'm working with a founder of a startup. She's very philanthropic. She's expecting that her company is going to be acquired in the next 6 months or so. She is busier than she's ever been in her entire life, but she knows she's going to have this significant windfall this year from her company being sold. She's also going to have a pretty significant tax bill that's going to come along with that. And she wants to do something with philanthropy in her life in the future, but she is quite busy right now. And the thought of deploying millions of dollars to causes she cares about when she's very focused on her business is just not practical. So we're working with her on a gift of privately held stock, a gift of her company's stock into the donor advised fund ahead of this anticipated transaction. She will then be able to take a tax deduction for the value of that gift. Sorry, I'm going too technical. And then she will basically, the donor advised fund will participate in the acquisition of the company. Liquidity will flow into the DAF. And in the future, this entrepreneur will have a nice pot of money in her donor advised fund that she can use to support the charities that she cares about. So that is the way we see a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs and other wealthy individuals using donor advised funds. It's really to deploy these assets where they can think about their whole balance sheet. They can think about real estate holdings, cryptocurrency, things that not every charity can accept directly. They can use their DAF to accept those kinds of more complex gifts so that then NPT can just send your organization a check that you can cash and have to support your agency's work. So David, how have you seen that with Catholic Charities?
Yeah, I think to answer this or to address this portion, I'm just going to tell a real world story. I did an honest assessment of Catholic Charities and our ability to accept real estate and cryptocurrency. And I knew that they couldn't handle it. Our CFO is incredibly busy. Further, she's incredibly conservative. And as Lisa just said, The realization through of let's say a complex asset through a DAF for the nonprofit is just a check. So I, as the gift planner, don't even tell finance I'm using DAFs to support Catholic Charities. They don't even need to know, so I don't. I work with the donor. We assess what they want to give. Because I am a gift planner, I could look at complex assets and think about capital gains and tax benefits. And I can say, let's look to here. I'm not having one conversation with finance. They don't need to know. They don't have any responsibility over it. All they get is a check at the end of this. So I see a DAF as yet another tool in my toolbox as a fundraiser, not as a nonprofit, not as someone in finance or someone exposing the agency to liability. I'm not. I sequester the liability through a partner agency. It's arguably the single most powerful tool I have found as a gift planner. Unlike remainder trusts and other tools, DAFs are so simple, so easy to use, so easy to understand that more and more I'm deploying them and I'm not telling the agency that I'm employed by. Another real world example is when my time at the American Cancer Society. I knew full well the American Cancer Society wasn't capable of endowing an event. American Cancer Society is a national agency with thousands upon thousands of volunteers. Working with a donor, she shared that her entire friendship circle formed from this event. She went to an American Cancer Society local event for 20 years. She was on the planning committee for 20 years. All of her deepest friendships came from this event. And she said, I want to endow this event. So what I did is I never talked once to the American Cancer Society. I went to a sponsoring agency. We set up a testamentary, that means in her estate plan, a donor advised fund where her estate would dump over into the donor advised fund at the sponsoring agency. And then the pay policy, the payment policy, this goes to the very first question we talked about. The policy was endowed. So it only kicked out 5%. And then when it came to the American Cancer Society, it was to benefit the gala. And yes, I know what you're thinking. What happens when the gala goes away? We built right into the estate plan multiple succession plans. So it was a really eloquent solution that made everyone happy. My agency was happy because they were not exposed. It wasn't complicated. My donor was happy because they were fulfilled.
Great. Well, as we wrap up here, if there are more questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have some time to get to those, but I want to highlight just a couple of the resources that I mentioned. The white paper that this presentation is based on is available on National Philanthropic Trust's website. So just head to nptrust.org and there's a little section at the top for charities. So there you'll find not only these two resources on the screen, but also that DAF report I mentioned and lots of fun blog posts and all kinds of good stuff. So just one of many resources for you to peruse at your leisure. So David, take us home before we open it up for final questions.
Yeah, sure. Best practices. Communicate your work to the community, make it easy to give, make the community understand that you're familiar with DAFs. Very, very important. Include DAF language in your marketing materials, including them as the list of ways they can give. Cultivate DAF donors. Move DAF donors into your major gift and plan giving stewardship and engagement track. Engage the entire family by building strong relationships and trying to include the second generation. And then definitely see sponsoring agencies like, wonderful news, the Tri-Valley Community Foundation that's just coming. See them as a resource to you and your agency. They're a very powerful friend. Okay, that wraps up our conversation. If there's any questions, we're happy to take them. We also want to respect your time, of course.
So I think what we'll do for questions is there were a couple more in the chat that I'll go back to and ask you. And then I encourage participants to add questions to the chat or also use the raise your hand function, which I think we're all familiar with in Zoom now. Probably use it in the participant and the reaction raise your hand will work better for me to see you. But if somebody else is looking, we'll try to capture that. So one of the questions, David, and this is kind of a follow-up to what you were saying, David, when you don't go back to Catholic Charities or American Cancer Society and have to worry about complex assets because it's just cash. So somebody asked, what if you get donations from DASH? What does that do for your, charitable, private, whether you're a public charity or convert into a foundation. Just view from the nonprofit standpoint, is it correct? We just view those as a donation, as part of our revenue. And if our revenue exceeds certain standards, that changes potentially whether we're a public charity or have to convert to a private foundation as far as the public support test. Is that correct?
I don't think I quite understand the question.
Yeah, so the question is really, what impact do donations from donor advice funds have on public charities and their potential exceeding the kind of public support test?
Yeah, well, I think this is very important because it actually speaks to the work of sponsoring agencies, because one of the key jobs they do, and one of the reasons why that you pay a fee, is their job is to test that the outgoing grant from the DAF is going to a qualified charity, that it's passing that public support test. So it adds an additional layer of due diligence and confidence to the donor. Now, the data is showing us that almost all DAF grants are going to public charities, 501c3, and that's pretty easy to find given certain IRS schedules. But the sponsoring agency is very diligent. So I'm going to give you an example. I sing for Symphony Silicon Valley, and one time they had a singers fundraiser. Now, because we're in the United States and the arts aren't valued as much, in my opinion, they should be, I, as a singer, actually have to pay to contribute. They don't pay me to sing, I pay them to sing. And that's just the fact of the United States. So I pay a fee to sing, and then they had a fundraiser. And I gave some money to the choir fundraiser, and I used my DAF to support it. Well, what was really fascinating is the DAF sponsoring agency called me up and said, we need to know if this is paying for your participation. That's a benefit to you and we can't fulfill it. What I was proud about is the fact that they were adding that level of due diligence. So I hope that answers the question in that it doesn't really affect you as the public charity, but what it does is it adds an extra level of due diligence and confidence. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it helps. And I think it just depends on the size of the gift, right? So that's where each public charity would have to look at that. If they had a single donor, that could make a difference there. And then just, you touched on this before, just the whole kind of public discussion right now about the requirements and changes of the tax laws.
Sure.
I think, Lisa, you were very clear about what the data showed, is that actually 20% of the assets are being distributed. And there might be some single stories of very wealthy individuals, keeping their funds, but you gave a wonderful example of somebody who's anticipating a wealth event, doesn't have time to figure out how to distribute those funds. Just any general comments about the discussions about changes of legislation and where we go from there.
Lisa, you want to go first or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I can share that there is some proposed legislation that would have some impact on donor advice funds and private foundations and some other charitable vehicles. We're in kind of a wait and see mode about that. And I think that was really part of the reason that David and I today wanted to focus on these more kind of practical, tangible things that you and your charities can be doing. Because no matter if some changes happen to donor advice funds and private foundations or not through this proposed legislation, we think that everything we share today will still be practical and useful to you all. And David, what would you add there?
Well, one statistic I forgot to share, and I think it's really important, is that 80% of all charities in the United States have received a DAF gift. So the data just is constantly showing that even though there's assumption of that DAFs are lock boxes and that nonprofits are not getting access to them, the data is showing that that's not the case. And the last thing I'll just share is I've spent a lot of time listening, reading, and trying to learn proposed legislation that never passes. I have looked at the current regs that people have tried to put up. It's interesting to me, but I'm not going to waste brain space until it becomes law. And I don't think you should either.
All right, great advice there. Any last questions? I don't see any hands raised or any more questions. Just a lot of kudos to both of you, David and Lisa. Thank you for all this information and really getting us at nonprofit organizations to think differently, right? And think of how we can use donor advised funds to our advantage and really just cultivate those donors like we would any other donors. Because as we pointed out from the data, there are already our donors and they can be very generous donors to our organization. So thank you very much for contributing all the information you did and increasing our knowledge base.
Thank you.
So I'd like to invite Kathy, do you have any closing comments that you would like to share as from TVNPA?
I was on mute. Okay, want to thank you very much for coming out again and sharing. It was really helpful. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. From the chat, it looks like that was the case. I wanted to remind you of our program real quick that we have taking place on September 28th, and we encourage you to attend. You can find that on our website at tvnpa.org. You can also find more information on our membership. If you're not already a member of TVNPA, we really encourage you to consider joining. We are continuing to increase our member benefits, and it also helps support the organization so that we can continue to go forward and bring these great programs to you. So again, I want to thank David and Lisa so much. And thank you, TVNPA Board, Program Committee, and everyone else who helps make this possible. So thank you.